Imagine a nightmare. You are trapped with your abuser. Fear is your constant companion. Every day you fear for your safety, for your life. Then one day the abuse escalates. You fight back, desperate to survive. But instead of finding safety and justice, you find yourself behind bars. This is the horrifying reality for countless women across the globe. They are imprisoned for defending themselves against domestic violence. These women are punished for their abuser's actions. Their voices, their stories are silenced within the very system meant to protect them. The legal system often fails to recognize the complexities of domestic violence. It often views these cases as isolated incidents. The history of abuse, the power imbalances, the constant fear, these critical factors are often ignored. This results in a grave miscarriage of justice. Women who have endured years of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse are painted as the aggressors. Their survival instincts are misconstrued as criminal intent. This issue extends far beyond individual cases. It reflects deeply rooted societal biases. These biases often perceive women as weaker, less credible, and even deserving of violence. Their stories are a stark reminder of the urgent need for change. Esther Skaggs, a mother of 3, endured years of horrific abuse at the hands of her husband. She lived in constant fear. The abuse escalated with each passing day.
One night, fearing for my life and the safety of my children, I fought back.
This act of self-defense landed her a 14-year prison sentence. This case stands as a chilling example of how the justice system fails to protect victims of domestic violence. Esther's story is not an isolated incident. It shines a light on a systemic issue that demands our attention. The court failed to consider the years of abuse Esther had suffered. Her act of self-defense was judged in isolation, devoid of the context of her lived experience. The system, meant to protect her, turned against her. Her case highlights the urgent need for legal reforms that consider the dynamics of domestic violence. We need laws that recognize the pattern of abuse, the control, and the fear that define these relationships. Sentencing guidelines should account for the context of self-defense in abusive situations. Roberta Carlene Borden, a survivor of relentless domestic abuse, spent years trapped in a cycle of violence. Her abuser controlled her every move, isolating her from friends and family.
One night, fearing for my life, I defended myself, resulting in my abuser's death.
Instead of finding safety and justice, Roberta was sentenced to prison, her act of self-preservation labeled as murder. Despite clear evidence of abuse, the court did not acknowledge the years of terror Roberta had endured. Her desperate act to protect herself was misconstrued as a criminal offense, denying her the justice she deserved. This case highlights the critical need for legal reform in self-defense laws. We need laws that recognize the complex dynamics of domestic violence and the impact of prolonged abuse on victims' actions. Sentencing guidelines must consider the context of self-defense in abusive relationships, ensuring that survivors are not punished for protecting their lives. Roberta's story is a call to action. The legal system, designed to uphold justice, often becomes a labyrinth of obstacles for women who defend themselves against domestic abuse. Laws intended to protect can become instruments of oppression, trapping survivors in a web of legal complexities and biases. Many women, already traumatized by abuse, find themselves ill-equipped to navigate this complex system. They lack access to adequate legal representation and often face skepticism and disbelief from law enforcement and the courts.
The legal definition of self-defense itself often poses a significant barrier. The law often requires an immediate threat to justify self-defense. However, domestic violence is rarely a single incident. It is a pattern of power and control that unfolds over time. The constant fear, the psychological manipulation, and the calculated escalation of abuse often make it impossible to pinpoint a single moment of imminent threat.
Furthermore, ingrained gender biases within the legal system further complicate matters. Women who defend themselves are often stereotyped as hysterical, untrustworthy, or even the aggressors themselves. This bias seeps into every aspect of the legal process, from police investigations to courtroom proceedings. The result is a system that often fails to recognize the legitimate fears and experiences of women who have endured domestic violence. These systemic failures highlight the urgent need for comprehensive reform. The trauma of domestic abuse leaves deep, invisible scars. The psychological impact of violence can be devastating and long-lasting. When women who defend themselves are then imprisoned, they face a double injustice. They are punished for surviving. They are denied the opportunity to heal and rebuild their lives. The emotional distress of imprisonment compounds the trauma they have already endured. Imprisonment isolates these women from their support systems. They are separated from loved ones, including their children, further deepening their pain and isolation. The harsh and unforgiving environment of prison can exacerbate existing mental health conditions and create new ones. Anxiety, depression, PTSD, and suicidal thoughts are common among this population. The lack of adequate mental health care in many prisons adds another layer of suffering. Women who have experienced domestic violence often require specialized trauma-informed care. However, such care is often unavailable or inadequate within the prison system. This lack of support can have devastating consequences, leaving these women to cope with their trauma and mental health needs in isolation and despair. The cases of women imprisoned for defending themselves against domestic abuse expose a gaping chasm between justice and reality. It is a stark indictment of a system that often fails to protect those most vulnerable. This is a call for change, a demand for action. We can no longer tolerate a system that silences survivors and perpetuates injustice.
Reform must begin with our laws. We need to re-examine and redefine self-defense laws to reflect the realities of domestic violence. The law must recognize the cyclical nature of abuse, the psychological control, and the escalating danger that victims face. The concept of imminent threat, often used to justify self-defense, must be broadened to encompass the ongoing threat that victims experience within abusive relationships. We must also address the systemic biases that infect our legal system. Judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers need mandatory training on domestic violence and its impact on victims. This training should include education on implicit bias, trauma-informed questioning techniques, and the dynamics of power and control in abusive relationships.
It demands a fundamental shift in societal attitudes and perceptions. We must challenge the deeply ingrained biases that perpetuate a culture of silence and shame around domestic abuse. We must stop questioning the victims and start holding abusers accountable. For too long, society has turned a blind eye to the pervasive reality of domestic violence. We have normalized controlling behavior, excused emotional abuse, and minimized the impact of physical violence. This silence protects abusers and enables the cycle of abuse to continue. We must break this silence. We must start by believing survivors. Their stories, often shared at great personal risk, must be met with empathy and validation, not skepticism and judgment. We must listen with open hearts and minds, understanding that domestic violence knows no socioeconomic boundaries, no racial or ethnic divides. It can happen to anyone. This includes access to safe housing, affordable health care, and educational and employment opportunities. When survivors are empowered, they can break free from the cycle of abuse and create a brighter future for themselves and their families. Safe and affordable housing is crucial for survivors fleeing abusive situations. Shelters provide temporary refuge, but long-term solutions are needed. This includes expanding affordable housing options, providing rental assistance, and enacting laws that protect tenants from eviction based on domestic violence. Economic empowerment is also essential for survivors. Many abusers exert financial control, limiting their partner's access to money and resources. The fight for justice for women imprisoned for defending themselves against domestic violence requires a collective and unwavering commitment to amplifying their voices and raising awareness about this critical issue. We must use our platforms, our voices, and our resources to shine a light on this injustice and demand change. Advocacy starts with education. We must educate ourselves and others about the realities of domestic violence, the systemic failures that perpetuate it, and the urgent need for reform. We can do this by sharing information online, organizing educational events, and engaging in conversations with our families, friends, and communities. We must also support organizations working tirelessly on the front lines of this issue. These organizations provide legal aid, counseling, shelter, and advocacy for survivors. By donating our time, resources, and expertise, we can help these organizations continue their vital work. The journey towards a future free from violence and injustice begins with a fundamental shift in our individual and collective consciousness. We must move beyond simply acknowledging the problem of domestic violence to actively dismantling the systems and beliefs that perpetuate it. This requires a multifaceted approach, encompassing legal reforms, social change, and a deep commitment to empowering survivors. We must create a world where women feel safe, supported, and empowered to leave abusive relationships without fear of retribution or judgment. This requires a societal shift towards believing and supporting survivors, challenging harmful gender norms, and promoting healthy relationships based on equality and respect. The legal system, designed to protect, must be reformed to reflect the realities of domestic violence. This includes revising self-defense laws, addressing systemic biases within the justice system, and ensuring that survivors have access to adequate legal representation and support.